Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. We have a full house here. Over this way, we have Tracy Baggiano. Welcome back, Tracy.
Thank you. Good evening.
Over that away, we have Mala. Welcome again, Mala.
Good evening, everyone.
And down here, we can welcome back Cotter.
Hi, everybody.
So Mike Christensen, special guest star, Mike Christensen. So, couple of announcements before we get started. One announcement, and then one discussion, and then more discussions, and then derailing rant, and then trying to bring us back with a discussion, and then a little bit of domain. So that's the agenda for tonight. Our topic, number one, quick note in case you have noticed the meetup page. Our meeting tomorrow, we had a little bit of a speaker, got to do things, and we needed to sub in somebody. And thankfully, Marsha Pierce was able to step up on short notice. Now, she hasn't actually sent the actual abstract of what the talk will be about, but it'll probably be something storage related given her role at Pure Storage. And
she said something about top 10 stories, blah, 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 something or the others when I talked to her on the phone. So,
okay. I mean, as long as it's the top 10.
It's definitely storage related. So, so that's why I put storage stuff.
Yep. As long as it's like the top 10 and not, 5 through 11. I don't want to see just 5 through 11. I want to see from the top.
Or the last 90 or something.
Right, exactly. I don't want that like bottom 90. No.
She has something that she's done, so I was like, yeah, that'll do. Yeah, we haven't had a talk on that in a while. So
yeah, exactly.
And she hasn't talked to us in I don't know how long.
It's been a minute.
Years.
It's been a minute, but
I can't remember the last time she did, so that's why I asked her.
So Marsha will be remote, given that she's out in Tennessee, but yes. We will be in person, and that's tomorrow at Tech Systems. Come on by, check it out, and it should be a really good talk. So Marsha does a great job. Definitely looking forward to it. Now, Matt Gordon, we have him rescheduled for, I think it's February, Tracy?
Yes.
So he will be doing it. We haven't banned him yet. No, but
and his current plans are to come back in person in February. So.
Yep. So we are looking forward to seeing Matt again, assuming that that's not the day in February when it snows.
The one day, yeah.
The one day.
Or the day before happened. When you're supposed to fly in,
That has happened. I have had to cancel TriPass meetings because, well, this is the day when it snowed. Oh, well. But we are looking forward to seeing Matt in person. Actually got a chance to see him in SQL Saturday Columbus on Saturday. So he is doing well. Just had some good stuff with his family, but it kind of made it so that he wasn't going to be able to present. So we are looking forward to seeing him again in February. Next up, I want to talk an article, and then we'll get to a topic that I've got on the agenda. But the article, especially since I know, Mala, you weren't feeling the best earlier today, so I want to make sure that you have your opportunity to rail against this article. And I may or may not rail along. We'll see. But let's share the screen here, and we have the AWS database blog, How to Plan for a Successful Database Modernization, and a couple of authors. Basically, this is a really long article. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. What I'll do is hit their 4 major concepts of, well, this is how you do cloud modernization or cloud enablement for databases. So lift and shift. In the AWS example, that's just running things on EC2. In Azure, it's running on Azure virtual machines using a managed database service. The article here talks about RDS, the relational database services for SQL Server or Oracle. The Azure equivalent would be like Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL Managed Instance, that kind of thing. And then they push you into, well, really, you should think about getting out of relational databases, but first get out of the commercial database and go to AWS Aurora, which is MySQL and Postgres compatible, and then look at their custom databases like DynamoDB or Amazon Neptune or their Document DB, which is totally different from Azure Document DB, which is now Cosmos DB. So they have these 4 patterns for migration, and I'd say on the whole, yeah, those are pretty common patterns for database migration into a cloud service. There's a bit more in here where they're trying to sell you on some of the what they consider the higher level options for this, and getting into, oh, well, this is why it's so beneficial. Some of this is marketing fluff. I will lay out up front. But Mala, you sent this article in. You had grievances you wanted to air, and
No, I mean, you covered it. You covered what I wanted to say mostly, Kevin. It's like my grievances in no particular order. Number one, it says very little about architecting for the cloud, and modernization, to my mind at least, is a lot more than moving stuff to the cloud, I think. So if you want to call the article as how do you move stuff to the cloud, I get it totally, but it calls it modernization, and most of it has to do with how you make use of Amazon's cloud offerings. And then having lift and shift there without clearly stating some of the issues with lift and shift, and especially with larger servers that need a lot of CPU processing power and all of that. Yeah, sure. I mean, I work at a place where we've seen what happens with that firsthand, so I'm not a fan of that. And I didn't think that was a great thing. There's Marshall weighing in on exactly that. And then that thing about getting rid of SQL Server or Oracle and going to Aurora, like, okay, cool. So to me, most of it came across as marketing fluff. And I hope the people reading it get it, but I doubt that. Quite a number of people are going to think this is what they need to do and all of that.
yeah. So to Marshall's question, how inefficient is lift and shift to use AWS as a hardware replacement compared to re-architecting existing software to use various native systems? I know it's a hard comparison, but maybe people here have some experience to use as possible feedback. Lift and shift is usually almost always going to be more expensive. And you can immediately understand why it's going to be more expensive, just because, well, you got to pay for the people who are hosting and monitoring and maintaining all of that hardware in AWS or in Azure. So prices are going to be more than if you just buy the hardware yourself. I know that both Microsoft and Amazon have their ROI guides. They have their spreadsheets where you can plug in and say, well, how much are you really paying for the data center and for all that electricity and stuff, like assuming that you're the one owning the data center versus using it. But even when you factor in those data center costs, generally that hardware is more expensive. There can be other benefits around using AWS or Azure virtual machines instead of buying your own hardware, but we are starting to see some articles. So, meaning this is a thing that's already happening, but articles of companies that have moved entirely to the cloud saying, we're actually going to bring some of it back on premises because we can save significant amounts of money in these particular cases. So I think if you want to save money in the cloud, you do have to re-architect existing software. You have to architect based on cloud patterns. It has to be event-driven. It's got to focus on what is the least expensive way to propagate data, which generally tends to be events driven by very cheap functions, versus provisioning amounts of compute and then hoping that that will be sufficient for your task for the next X number of years. So I know one of the exercises that the pre-sales folks tend to do at both of those companies is, well, how much of that hardware are you really using? Because we tend to overbuy local hardware under the idea that this is capitalized. It's capitalized over a 3-year or a 5-year period usually. And so we can't buy new hardware for 3 years or for 5 years until we have exhausted the capitalization of that hardware in most circumstances. So for that reason, people tend to plan what's the hardware that I need 5 years from now versus what's the hardware that I need right now. And if that number is radically different, or if you've overestimated what you really do need, then there's potentially a case where you could actually save money by going to cloud virtual machines that are much smaller scale. But usually, I don't think you're going to save very much on that either. It could be, that's going to depend on the company itself and just how aggressive the purchasers were in terms of hardware. But I think in your average scenario, that may help break even. But I don't see a lot of companies losing, saying, oh, we dropped our total IT expenditures by 30% by moving to the cloud. About the only way that you could probably get away with that is if you've completely re-architected a platform, or if you start as a cloud company. You initially develop with this cloud model as opposed to developing based on the assumptions of what works well on premises.
Also, I've seen when I used to do consulting, I've seen too many cases of people thinking it's going to be expensive, but not that expensive without giving it any kind of number in their mind. And then, then they get a sticker shock on how much it really costs. And they want to use it as a substitute for something they didn't do right in the on-prem environment. They'll rented a bad place to host the servers, or something happened, the building got flooded, or, some such thing. And they think a substitute for that, oh, let's go to the cloud, we're not going to have all these issues and all of that. And typically, I don't know, I have not seen that work very well. Like what Kevin said, I agree. Without architecting, then, your money is going to, unless you are clear that, you're going to pay for that, and that's okay, which very few people really are.
Yeah. And now I think also a part of this is that companies tend to under provision for availability, under provision for disaster recovery. Mm-hmm. So you tend to have, oh, well, what's your DR plan? Well, our DR plan is never to have a disaster. But in practice, like, oh, we've got these machines over here that we had 10 years ago, and that's our DR site. All right, well, have you actually tested these and made sure that your current workload can run on those 10-year-old machines? And where are they located? Are they far enough out that, if a disaster happens, you could get those on? And could you also get your current data over to them? And a lot of companies that I've worked with have struggled with this idea. So that is a benefit to having even if it's virtual machines in a cloud environment, because now you can get, in Azure, you've got scale sets. In AWS, there are VM replicas. You can have high availability. You can have disaster recovery. And those are usually closer to checkboxes versus 6-month plans. But you're paying 2 to 3 times as much as if you cheaped out and just had the single virtual machine, which is kind of equivalent to what people are doing on premises of, well, we've got a server, and hopefully it never fails. So that's another area where you start looking at that Azure bill or that AWS bill, and the prices kick up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And people look at it originally like, wow, why is this so expensive? Well, it's because you have this 4-node availability group where you've got 3 of them highly available and a 4th one as in DR zone, and you're also paying for this multiple terabytes of premium storage, and you also have very highly provisioned, like lots of vCores. So yeah, your Azure SQL DB bill is really high. But that is also part of the cost of making sure that your stuff stays up. I know high availability is something companies don't want to pay for until it fails, at which point they want it. And you can also most certainly do high availability on premises. You can probably do it cheaper, but requires some level of expertise. So, did you have anything else on this article you wanted to talk about, Mala?
No, that's it.
No ranting about RDS?
Oh, it's been a while. No, that's it. I think we covered what we wanted to say.
Okay. Well, nonetheless, I will say my thoughts on this article. Yeah, it's marketing fluff. It's very fluffy. That said, I think that it does cover the major scenarios at least. So at least it gives you an idea of these are your primary options. Now, I'm going to poo-poo purpose built a lot because most of the time I think that this is the wrong answer. I think this is developers falling in love with new ideas that are actually very old ideas and not wanting to just basically switching things for the sake of change versus actually having a real use case that necessitates a graph database or a document database. But even with me playing that down pretty hard, there are specific cases where, yeah, you know what, that document database actually does make sense for this scenario. However, this feels like the area where pre-sales people really try to push. And I think part of it is this is where they get a lot of their high margin sales because Amazon has to pay Microsoft for those SQL Server licenses that they use for RDS. They don't have to pay Microsoft for Aurora, and they don't have to pay Microsoft for DynamoDB or DocumentDB or Neptune. They're taking all the revenues for these top line ones. And as a result, they also tend to be pretty expensive services. On the Azure side, Cosmos DB is a very expensive service. And I think that's maybe a little cynically, that's why pre-sales tends to push it so much that, hey, you know what? I got to get one customer to agree and my expected revenue goes up considerably because, well, Cosmos is an expensive service, especially if you do it wrong, which a lot of the time, if you're migrating to Cosmos, you're probably going to do it wrong. Just because it looks SQL-like, it acts SQL-like, it's not SQL-like. It's very different in terms of what is an appropriate architecture for the document structure underneath. And I think a lot of developers end up getting that wrong as a result.
That's very good to know, Kevin. I was not aware. Thank you.
So I'm going to stop sharing for the moment because next thing I want to talk about, not an article. We'll get back to articles in a moment. But wanted to talk about our third week of the month meeting, which happens to be tomorrow. So we have had a few of these in person. This will be our fourth one in person. And in-person turnout's not great so far. We've had a few people who have shown up pretty consistently, and I certainly appreciate those people who are able to make it in. But I know that there are a lot of people who are either not in the area or just it hasn't worked out where they're able to make it in. And so I did want to broach this as a topic because our gracious sponsor, Tech Systems, basically saying, hey, we love hosting you, but we have to be able to host more than a few people. So I wanted to open this up to people for ideas, see what your thoughts are, especially if you're in the area. If you're 1,000 miles away, obviously you're not coming to a meeting in person. That's fine. Understandable. But for people who are local, if there are things that are preventing you from attending meetings in person that that you're willing to talk about, certainly open to hearing about this. I will say, if we're continuing to get just a couple of people in person, then it will be a real challenge for us to keep in-person meetings. So, assuming the status quo, assuming that there will continue to be only a couple of people who show up in person for that third week meeting, I think our two major options are either we go back to entirely remote, or we make that meeting in person only, and the other two meetings are remote only. Those are the two options that I came up with, but part of why I'm talking about this is I want to talk to everybody, get ideas from you. I'm also going to send out an email to the broader user group. This isn't something we're going to put into place tomorrow, no matter what great ideas people come up with, but it is something that we may have to have by August. So wanted to get some ideas, get some thoughts.
Well, my excuse for the next 2 months is I'll be presenting for other user groups virtually. So I will be back with you in person in September.
That's
Are you
fair.
going to be there tomorrow, Tracy?
Huh?
Are you going to be there tomorrow?
No, I'm presenting for I don't know, some user group in Indiana tomorrow. And then I'm presenting for Charlotte next month. So see you in September in person.
Yep, I think Marshall hits on a big reason. It's fairly inefficient to do something in person when I don't have to leave the house for anything else. I hate leaving the house personally, so I get that. But back when I needed to go to the office, it was far more convenient because, hey, I'm already nearby. And right. I think if that ends up being the norm for a lot of people, then being virtual only, being remote only is a viable option. It is something that I don't think it's my preferred option, but I will say if that's the way that it ends up being, then I'm personally okay with it. Whatever happens, we will certainly have that third meeting of the month, or that third week meeting, and this is more a question of, logistically, how does it work out? So it's not going away. It's just a matter of, how are we going to what's the most efficient route for organization? Or does it make sense to have anything be in person? Or are we at a point where remote only is here to stay? I like doing things in person. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, Kevin. Didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying, I was talking to two people before we got on this meeting from other user groups who have the same exact challenge. So we are not alone in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've seen that as well, where even when you have that in-person only experience, that's not necessarily going to bring in a lot of people. So there may be some marginal people where, hey, I'm okay going either way, but because it's easier, I'm just taking the easier route and being online.
The question is, if we chop off the easy route, will the people show up in person?
Yes, and that is a good question, because if it turns out that the answer is no, then I'd rather just have us be remote only.
Yeah, I agree. I want to have the meeting, but like I said, if we take out the remote aspect, does that mean people will actually show up in person?
Right. Yeah, there's a challenge. There's a question behind that, and this is part of why.
Not a mandate, just a question.
Yeah. Probably later this week, I'll send out a quick email to the entire user group, because certainly not everybody watches Shop Talk, and that's okay. So I'll send out an email to the entire user group and get some thoughts from people. Huge amount of content online compared to pre-2020 days. People are used to Hangouts and Zoom calls. Yeah, though there's also been a lot of drop-off in terms of willingness to jump into user group meetings. I think they're I don't know that I need to.
Go ahead. A local user group, so it's supposed to be local people getting together for presentations and stuff. So that's what we're trying to foster, is the local community getting together and local people socializing
No,
around
I
SQL
get that.
Server, not be.
Yeah.
I'm telling everybody else what we're trying to
Sure.
do. I know everybody else. I get that it's a challenge, but this is
Right.
what we were doing pre-pandemic, so that's what we're trying to get back into is having more of the local people together talking about SQL Server, and you don't get the socialization with the local DBAs hearing the stories and talking about things if we're only online. So,
Yeah, yeah, and one of the things that we were able to do before a little bit easier was, to Tracy's point, hey, we've got a new person in the area. Now you can meet people. You could potentially job shop. You could potentially try to recruit people for a job. Whereas it's a lot harder to do when we're all just in chat.
Oh,
So
sure. I mean, I completely agree about that. I
yeah,
just think
but
those times are not going to come back very quickly, though.
right, right. So
Yeah.
I don't know that we need to extol the virtues of the in-person meeting. I think most people get it. But there are some virtues to it, and that's kind of why
Oh,
I'd love to.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to have. Actually, I like hybrid. I bought all that equipment for a reason. We were hybrid back in 2019. So that idea, that's a something that I've always had been wanting, but I think given current circumstances, hybrid might not be tenable for our
Mhm.
main meeting. And that said, I am absolutely open to ideas from people. It doesn't have to be this option or that option. If there are other options on the table, definitely want to hear about them. And eventually, ultimately, we'll work something out either where we're bringing in enough people to make it worthwhile for our gracious host to continue graciously hosting, or we say, yeah, at this point, I don't know that we can make it. In-person interaction and networking is the best. Yeah, yeah, but the world has changed a lot, right? So that's a challenge. I don't think there's a good online alternative. I don't want to have everybody jump onto camera types of stuff. Um, that's not. I don't want to have that be the case. Um, so I don't believe that some sort of like online meeting really fills a gap there. Um, I know that some groups have done informal things like get together for lunch, but those tend to be fairly sparsely attended. So I don't think I'd want to do that either necessarily. Um, but But yeah, most hosts do like numbers to justify sponsorship for sure. If we're regularly drawing in 30, 40 people for a meeting, uh, that gives a lot of opportunity for whoever's hosting to at least have that swag of, hey, we got all these people coming in here, and then possibly here's my pitch for this recruiting company or for this agency or for this organization. Hey, we're hiring database people. So there's there's the justification. I mean, that's the tech systems has been great to us. They've been hosting us since before I came to North Carolina, and so there's nothing wrong with that relationship there. But um, we just have to figure out, uh, can we get to a point where there are enough people in person to make that worthwhile, or do we say, you know what, let's just keep it remote and perhaps look again at some point in the future. So, or make it in person only, and then if you want to show up, then, or if you want to see it, then you'll have to show up.
Right.
There might be options for post-event recording or something, but I'm not sure. That's something we'd have to think through. But I'd like to ask everybody, if you're in chat, you have thoughts. Certainly reach out to me if you have additional thoughts. If you have, hey, here's an idea that may work, and I will, as promised, send out that email at some point this week, making it open for everybody who's in the group, not just Shop Talk attendees. And know that on the board, we started talking about this today, and we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to try to flesh out some ideas. And
How do you
see.
find attendance at the live events you're going to, Kevin? The SQL Saturdays and such.
Some of those SQL Saturdays are back to maybe 60-70% of where they were. Some of them might be closer to 100, but I don't know. I'm not sure who's at 100% of prior attendance. I think 60-70%. Columbus was probably about 60-70% of what it had been in 2019, just from eyeballing.
Yeah.
And Andy Warren's had some posts about the events that he's gone to, that he's helped organized, and it seems like from his eyes also we're looking 60-70%. And that's for the large events. For smaller events like user group meetings, I think they're probably closer to like 30%.
Yeah, user group meetings, I'm hearing the same thing.
So that is the current challenge, and we'll have more thoughts on the topic as we noodle things out. But certainly, if you have ideas, talk to us. All right. I'm going to bring back up sharing because we have another article coming up. So this particular article comes from the Register.
I want to sneak a minute to post that the past community summit sessions are live. Anyone who's interested in going, it's a 100% in-person conference. And I posted the sessions there.
All right. Let me pop that up. Oh, I see. It's only a tab. Look at that. I'm sharing a tab. There we go. So, sessions, keynotes, pre-cons. Hey, Melody's doing a keynote. Okay. So
Yeah,
that's
Melody and Ben are doing a keynote. That should be fun.
It's been a minute since I've seen Ben in person. He used to come to a bunch of SQL Saturdays in the U.S. I'm like, you're coming in from a long distance. I respect that, especially all the mileage, all the points you're getting from miles. So I think PASS went full in person for the same aspects of what you've been talking about here. Try to see if it's going to get more people to attend and greater in-person value interactions and overall value. I agree. Also, for bigger conferences, that something we've talked about a few times here is that hybrid experience for a major conference is extremely difficult because you have to have really good Wi-Fi, you have to have really good camera setup and AV people, and the more rooms that you have, the more challenge that ends up being, because otherwise you're either going to end up with a bad experience for the people who are in person or a bad experience for the people who are online.
Bits pulled off pretty well, Kevin.
What's that?
SQL Bits. SQL Bits did a great job. They're keeping it coming year two, from what I'm hearing, the hybrid model. Yeah,
so it's doable if you have the infrastructure, if you have as well the desire to do it. It's something that I think is doable, but it is also a challenge. And so, yeah, I do believe that past Summit, going back to in person, that is part of the reason why. I know that they had some challenges with some of their hybrid work that, like, if this wasn't Summit, actually, I think this was a Microsoft conference, but where people would walk in and saying, oh, here's your session. It's a pre-recorded session from somebody, and you're all coming in person to sit and watch this pre-recorded session in a room. That's not a great experience.
So Bits did one room, Just one room. Less than 20% of us were virtual. All my sessions, I did 2 sessions. Both of my sessions were very well attended. Over 30 attendees. It didn't mess with their in-person experience at all in any way. They had problems the year before last with some tech issues, which even doesn't. But last year they took care of those things. We had a rehearsal and we had everything going very smoothly. Uh, it's very helpful to people like us who are restricted travel wise. This year too, they told me that they're doing a blended option.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but as far
But
as
for
past,
Summit is a lot more complicated. Just given that the convention center is not very set up. It's not set up to have a virtual event going on parallelly with an in-person event. The summit, the location itself is a problem. And it's a very old building. They have some Wi-Fi, but it's not the best. They have all sorts of issues there, and that kind of messes up with having a good virtual option on the side.
agreed, agreed.
Yeah.
Um, but if you are going to pass Summit, early bird pricing ends not too long from now, so you can get the 3-day pass for $1,800, and then a pre-con is $600. So be sure to check that out if you're going. I will not be there, but a lot of people will be. So Tracy will be there. There you go. So check that out.
You can come learn how to achieve your goals from me. Just me.
Well,
That's what I'm speaking on.
yeah. And if that's not worth $1,800, I don't know what is. Achieving goals, that's worth a lot of money. So, all right, next article. This one also came from Mala, out of the register, and this is so there was a Twitter thread. I'm not going to open up the Twitter thread. Basically, the gist of the article is, hey, I can replace my customer support team with a shell script. Now, in this case, it was a AI chatbot, but the tweet thread was a lot tone deaf. But the concept, I don't think is necessarily a bad idea. So the idea is using a bot to answer common customer questions. And if you get it to work well, that is, I think, a perfectly reasonable business use for chatbots, even for chat-driven services. Now, before we go too far, one of the banes of my existence, and actually it's probably something I probably need to fill out the form sometime soon. North Carolina's Department of Motor Vehicles used to have a website where you could go to, click a few buttons, and then you could renew your registration for a year. Now
Yeah.
you have to... What's that, Mala?
No, I mean I used to like their website. What about it? I'm curious.
Well, they changed it so that you have to interact with a chatbot. It's like, oh, it looks like you're renewing your registration. And then, here, type in your registration number. Here, type in this detail. Here, type in this detail. Like, you could have just given me a form to fill out, and then I could click the button and be done with this instead of having a derpy chatbot pretending to be human. Yeah, like Marshall says, it's a waste of time. And so I imagine that there are some people who were afraid of the form. The form was terrifying. I find it really hard to get into the mindset of a person who is terrified by a form, but I know those people exist, and I'm not making fun of those people, mind you, but it is a real challenge for me to want to interact with a machine very slowly when I could just interact with a form very quickly and get my job done. In this case, I found it interesting if the person who ran this thread is actually correct, that if most of your customer woes are things that you could solve in a very short amount of time with a Chat GPT wrapper. I'm wondering how bad your customer support team was to begin with. Because if they're dealing with really basic stuff and struggling, that's a problem in itself. But time to first response becoming immediate, that makes sense. And actually using a chat service as that first line of defense, I think it's something a lot of companies ought to look at. They don't necessarily need to do it, but at least have that be the starting point. And if you can answer, basically be first tier tech support, have you tried turning it off and on again? And you can make that a bot. You can make that a script. Depending on how sophisticated the process is, on how much information you have available, you might even get a reasonable result from that tier 1 tech support bot. And then if tier 1 bot can't figure it out, then bounce it up to tier 2 human. If you fed it knowledge and history from prior problems being solved, then you can have a lot of good value there. Yeah, it's a step ahead of, here's your frequently asked questions list. And assuming that they are actual frequently asked questions as opposed to marketing gibberish that you put together because, of course, we need a FAQ. If they are real frequently asked questions, then you've got some value in that FAQ, but people don't like to read. So having the chat bot essentially be an advanced FAQ makes sense. And that's where I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. Now, then talking about how, hey, we were able to lay off like 90% of our customer service people as a result, probably not the smartest thing to brag about in a tweet, but some people are going to be that way. Nonetheless, the article, I'm going to get past the preachiness of the article and the silliness of the owner, but I did want to mention, yeah, this is something that we are seeing more of. Microsoft does have patterns around using Teams for in the past few years. It's been chatbots, and they've gone into public preview on a lot of stuff for, hey, here's Microsoft 365 Copilot. That's mostly internal stuff, but also OpenAI wrappers around your customer's information using things like Microsoft Semantic Kernel to embed that into your own applications, or even just having that OpenAI API call where you can feed in information. You could, to Marshall's point, pass in information on, okay, here's the customer's billing record, here's the customer's service record, here are whatever relevant features we think may be impacting what that question looks like, and then potentially as part of the prompt, and then getting back some hopefully useful response. And so as a first tier tech support, okay, I can see this as useful. As replace all tech support, probably not. Almost definitely not unless you have a trivial environment. But that first tier, how do I open up your product? Maybe. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Mala?
No, I actually agree with what you were saying, Kevin. It sounded to me like, I was not a fan of how that guy went online and bragged about letting go of that many people. But again, stupid people exist everywhere. So if it is something that those people were actually doing what that bot was doing, then I don't know. Some people are saying that you're being too entitled by saying a job is boring even, but I'm sure it was pretty boring.
Maybe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, if you wanna look at the thread, it is right here. I didn't even open up register comments. I don't know if I should.
Oh, I don't read any comments at all.
Ha ha. Yeah.
But
Uh,
yeah, and the article comments are just not worth reading. Just all kinds of stuff goes on there.
Well, there was a good article about some companies that use kind of whisper prompts. So, kind of a take on it. It's like to make customer service reps more efficient. It'll say like maybe this person should be upsold on this, or maybe you should look in the FAQ in this area. So it makes them more efficient, um, and helps them. It's not perfect, but it stresses people out too because it makes people too efficient.
well.
Well, I think also like this kind of basic chatbots have been around for a long time.
Yeah.
So when they use this kind of a clickbait headline like outsource the job to AI, which is what everybody is scared about and is looking for, it's kind of misleading because it's this sort of stuff has been around for like very very long. It's not anything new. I mean, he
Oh,
wrote some
yeah.
software on his own to do some basic first level triage with that and replaced his people with that. Okay, not a not very fun to listen to, but that's been going on for some time.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, I think the headline is totally clickbait.
Yes.
Yeah.
The tweet thread was clickbaity. The headline here is
Mhm.
clickbaity.
Mhm.
I agree with you, Mala. This
Is
is
that Warren Beatty's brother? Who's that?
exactly the Ron Howard of websites. Um, yeah, it's definitely. I believe that the article headline here is overblowing things, but then so was the tweet thread. It's like, yeah, congratulations, you implemented what sounds like a fairly useful service. So I'm not uh, dunking on, haha, you just did something basic, but I also don't think this is some radical departure. It's just, oh, we're using large language models now instead of what people were using 15 years ago to create chatbots, Markov chain, uh, Monte Carlo simulation, or just Markov chain analysis, or anything else involving Markov chains. I think that's what I'm driving at here. But or even just having here's your IRC bot where type in a command and get a response. So having that sort of command driven option. Press 1 if you're having a problem with billing. Press 2 if you're having a problem with sales. That, these things have been around. Having to spend a little bit less time on trying to come up with good answers, especially if you have frequently asked questions, if you have a good uh, case listing where you have good solutions of here was the question and here was the actual solution, that helps a lot. And being able to use that information as the basis for prompts or for an additional trained layer, that I think is where you can find some additional gains over the chatbot approach. Because remember, it was probably about 4 to 5 years ago. That was when Facebook and Microsoft and several other companies were really getting in on chatbots. That
Mhm.
everybody's got to use chatbots. I remember Facebook pushing this real hard several years ago. That if you're not using chatbots, everything's going to fall apart because chatbots are so much better than anything else. And look how easy it is to generate one, and all you need is here's the question and here's the answer. And then it turns out that if you ask the question in a way which is slightly different from what your developers anticipated, then the chatbot has no idea what you're talking about.
Mhm.
This is, I believe, potentially a more broadly acceptable interpretation of those bots, where okay, you didn't type in exactly the keyword, but you typed in a similar enough one that the algorithm is able to anticipate what the desired intent is, versus having to specify this keyword in your intent for the chatbot. So I guess prompt versus intents. So yeah, that's the other article here. I've got one more thing that I wanted to mention, and that's because I don't think I've mentioned it on Shop Talk before, but season 2 of Cousteau Detective Agency is out. Now, if you're not familiar with the Cousteau Detective Agency, this is a really cool way of learning KQL, but I will say the expectation is you are already fairly familiar with the language KQL. If you're not at all familiar with it, then you will probably struggle. You will definitely struggle unless you get a walkthrough. But the idea of the Cousteau Detective Agency is that there are 2 seasons. If you're new with this, start with season 1. And you are a brand new detective, and you're going to use your Data Explorer cluster, which you can create one for free at aka.ms/Cousteau free. And you use your Data Explorer cluster to import data, to work with this information, and execute a series of scripts, bring in data, analyze that data to solve problems. So they have things like, what is the sum of the score column when you pull in this onboarding CSV gzip? Then you would pop open Data Explorer, you would run the queries, and you write your own KQL to solve these questions. It starts out simple as just sum up these numbers and give me the result, but it quickly gets more complicated in terms of doing groupings and locations. One of the early questions is, well, there's a bank robbery and we have license plate traffic, like license plate indicators of who was in different locations at different times across these 2 streets. So find the 4 cars that are the cars owned by the perpetrators of that robbery. Or one of my favorites on there was that you had to find, in New York City, there's a database of trees. So every tree that is in public spaces in New York City has its geolocation, it has its species, it has information on watering, how often it gets watered, that kind of stuff. This is what their I don't know exactly which service it is, if it's Parks and Rec or who, but whichever service actually does maintenance of those trees in New York City, they use that database to figure out how they need to get around and take care of the plants. But essentially, the question was, go find 3 separate species of trees, distinct species of trees within a certain radius, and go open up Google Maps and do the map search in that area and look at areas around it to help solve this question. So it gets very complicated. The product team that put this together, I'm sure they had a lot of fun with it. So this is actually run by Microsoft. This is something that their product teams, their Azure Data Explorer product team put together. And I highly recommend it if you haven't tried this before. Also, there are walkthroughs for Season 1 for sure. There probably are walkthroughs for Season 2 at this point. You can go find trees, but can you find specific trees?
Mm-hmm.
I need this specific birch that's right next to this specific type of whatever. That's next to a cherry tree. You got to have a database for this, Mala. But yeah, if you've ever been interested in learning KQL, this is a really good way to do it. So I figured I would give it a little plug. If you're not familiar with the idea, definitely a good site to check out. And
so as the functions and things like that are written in KQL, right, Kevin?
Azure Functions can be written in several languages. KQL, not so much. Instead, it'd be C#. You could technically do it in F#, but it's harder than it should be. Python, you can write them in JavaScript. You can write them in Java. I think there are a couple other languages. But KQL is used mostly for log analytics and for accessing Data Explorer, which you'll get from Synapse Data Explorer pools, from Microsoft Fabric Data Explorer.
Oh, okay. Okay,
So
Fabric.
basically
That's good.
event processing and log handling. The language itself looks a lot like Splunk.
Uh-huh.
I think it was designed to look very much like Splunk.
Okay,
but-
interesting. Okay, good to know.
Actually, I have a talk on learning KQL, which helps a little bit with some of the examples in here. I don't cover everything because I developed the talk before learning about the Cousteau Detective Agency, but the GitHub repository for my talk is right here. And so this is what that query language looks like. So you use pipes to separate out sections. Unlike SQL, it does not ingest it doesn't operate on the entire query at once. Instead, in this case, we would have inspections, and we want to perform filters as soon as possible, because as soon as this filter happens, then any aggregation or operation below it is going to work on that filtered data. So there can be a performance difference if you have broad filters and then narrow filters versus narrow filters and then broad filters. Or if you have even something like adding a column. So let me see if I can find a good example of adding a column in here.
So 7Z is where the data is. That a text kind of file, Kevin? It reminds me of that awful 7-zip, some zip program that used to be a annoying wonder.
7Z is the 7-zip format. Yes, that is a compression format which is much better than .zip or gzip. It's a pretty solid compression format.
Oh, so that's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, 7Z.
Okay.
But if you're interested in that talk, I do have the demos in here. I will say this involves my favorite data set, which is the Wake County, North Carolina restaurant inspection data. So it gets sets of restaurants and trying to understand
So what are
inspections.
the files that are compressed, Kevin? What is it compressed from?
Say again?
What is the file that it is compressed? How is that 7Z created? From what?
Oh, it was a CSV file that... Here, let me see if I have the original data. Yeah, so this was CSV data that you can get from Wake County's open data portal.
Oh, okay.
Every once in a while, like, here, let me see if I can pull that up. Wake County open data. So if the website is data.wake.gov. Durham County also has an open data portal, but most of its data is in GIS. So that's why I prefer Wake County, because I can search for data sets like restaurants in Wake County or restaurant inspections. So this is the actual restaurants, and it has 3,700 records. You can actually see the data table, and you're able to download it. So they'll let you download the one that somebody last created. By the way, that was probably me. July 16th. No, that was yesterday. So that was somebody who wasn't me. Somebody else is using this data set. That's great. So you can grab that data set for yourself. It is freely available. This is all open data, but restaurant inspections, food inspections is what it's called, and food inspection violations. So you're able to check those out, and it breaks out this information as the inspection, the score, and you can look at inspection violations and get a feeling for what exactly the code was that they violated, what the difficulty was, and how bad it is.
Mhm.
I
This
can't
is where I can plug our talk in October where can't remember his name, but the guy in Boston is going to be talking about mining the Azure logs using Custo and KQL. So you can actually, watch the talk on it with our main user group
There you
in
go.
person or hybrid because he's going to be whatever we do with the main group. So
Sounds like a plan. But all right, we're at the top of the hour now, everybody. Appreciate you
Thank you
sticking
so much.
around. Appreciate everybody. Tracy, Mike, Mala, glad to have all you here. And tomorrow, quick reminder, tomorrow will be hybrid no matter what we end up doing for the main meeting. Tomorrow will just be business as usual. So Marcia is going to talk to us about fun storage stuff, and hopefully we'll see you there in person. But regardless, until we see each other again, everyone, take care.
night.